All right, well, following our pattern from last week, we will, if you have questions, try to save them till the end. You can put them in the chat box, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. We try to make this about an hour, and then if you want to stay around after class for the questions and answers, you're welcome to. But again, thanks for being with us. And I just wanted to review, because we have to understand the theological component of anti-Semitism in order to understand Purim. Because if you remember, anti-Semitism is ultimately what kind of issue? Someone can unmute themselves. What kind of issue did we say anti-Semitism ultimately is? Anyone remember? It's all right. It's a spiritual issue, right? So some people might say anti-Semitism has to do with economics or politics or race or any of those things. And it certainly involves all of those. It touches all of those. But at its core, anti-Semitism is a spiritual issue, and it's a manifestation of Satan's conflict with God. If you remember, we talked about that last week. God doesn't have a conflict with Satan. God is sovereign. He doesn't need to fight with anyone. But Satan has a conflict with God. He does not want him to establish his kingdom. He does not want to see people saved. And part of that is he thinks if he can keep Israel from having her covenants fulfilled, if he can wipe out the Jewish people, then he'll be victor. Obviously not going to happen, but that does not stop him from his attempts. Secondly, just as a kind of a prelude, we have to also understand that we can't forget Deuteronomy chapter 28, where God tells the Jewish people that following their disobedience, they will be scattered. Following their breaking of the Mosaic covenant, they will be scattered throughout the world. And what's going to happen to them? In all the places where they're scattered, the Gentiles are going to persecute them, right? That is going to happen. It's not necessarily God causing it, but he's going to lift his hand off and allow his people Israel to be persecuted. So we have to keep that in mind as we look at the book of Esther and the festival of Purim. So let's do a little cultural background. And if you have your Bible, you can turn with me to Esther. It's not necessary, you don't have to have it, but if you want to follow along. So the festival of Purim, it's not a God-instituted holy day. So if you go to Leviticus 23 and you look at the list of all the festivals that God gave to the Jewish people, you'll never find Purim. You'll also, there's many you won't find, but you won't find Hanukkah, for example. But Purim and Hanukkah are interesting because even though they're not God-instituted holidays, holy days for the Jewish people, both of those holy days are mentioned in Scripture. So certainly Purim here in Esther, Hanukkah in John chapter 10, Jesus celebrates the Feast of Dedication or the Feast of Hanukkah. But Purim, even though it's not a God-instituted holy day, it is a celebration of God's protection of his chosen people. And ultimately, it's illustrative of his answer to anti-Semitism in all ages. Anti-Semitism is ultimately a losing battle, right? God has promised, right? One of my favorite passages in the scripture concerning Israel is in the book of Jeremiah, Jeremiah 31 through 37, where God says he's going to bring a new covenant. He's going to give a new covenant to the house of Israel and the house of Judah. And he then goes on to explain how nothing can destroy the Jewish people. And we looked at that last week, where Mark Twain said, what is the secret of their immortality? So the account in Esther takes place in Persia during the reign of Xerxes I. In ancient Persian, it's Ahasuerus. So depending on your translation of the Bible, you may have Ahasuerus or you may have Xerxes. And this took place about between 483 to 471 BC. So this is in the times before Christ. This is after the kingdom has divided. So if you remember, Judah and Benjamin are in the south, but it's called Judah. And in the north, you have the kingdom of Israel. They've split. Eventually, both the southern and the northern tribes are taken into captivity. And there's a key phrase or a key term in this book. And again, it depends on the translation you're using, but it essentially is, now it took place, or, and it came to pass. It's this phrase, it's God is telling us a story here. So these are time markers. Now it so happened, now it happened. But it's also interesting because in the book of Esther, you will not find God's name mentioned once. And yet, when you read that, now it took place, or now this happened, you can't help but see this is God's hand behind the curtain. If you picture a stage, his hand is always behind the curtain. He's rearranging the scene. He's putting the characters into place. He is in control. And so we have to, when we see these terms, now it took place or now it came to pass, keep in mind, this is essentially, these are not coincidences. This is God orchestrating all of this. So who are the cast members of Purim? Well, first of all, we have Ahasuerus, or Xerxes the First. Some refer to him as Xerxes the Great. He was born approximately 519 BC. He died in Iran, what is now Iran, in 565 BC, or excuse me, 465 BC. He was the son of Darius the First. Darius the First is mentioned in the book of Ezra. This is his son, Xerxes. And he reigned from about 486 to 465 BC. The second person we encounter, or major person we encounter in the account, is Queen Vashti. Evidently, she was a beautiful woman, and the king could call on her at any time to entertain. He would show her beauty to his entourage. We also have Mordecai. Interestingly, Mordecai. Anybody remember what tribe is Mordecai from? I'll give you a hint. Exactly. Thank you. Benjamin. There's another famous Jewish man in the New Testament from the tribe of Benjamin. What was his name? He wrote most of the New Testament, of the epistles. Paul, right? So Paul is of the tribe of Benjamin. Oh, Paul. So Paul and Mordecai, they're cousins, okay? Separated by centuries, but they're cousins. Either Mordecai himself or his great-grandfather Kish was an exile, taken from Jerusalem. And we see that in Esther 2:6. In the original, in the Hebrew, it's a little bit ambiguous as to who was the exile, if it's Kish or if it's Mordecai. And there's good reasons for both of those. But somebody in this was an exile. They were taken out of Jerusalem, and that's how they ended up ultimately in the Persian Empire after Persia took over from Babylon. Mordecai is a cousin of Esther. So some of you may be familiar with translations that came out of the Latin Vulgate. And in the Latin Vulgate, it says that Esther was Mordecai, or Mordecai was Esther's uncle. That's not, that was a typo, if you will. He is a cousin. He raised his cousin as his own daughter. And then we have Esther, and her Hebrew name is Hadassah, which Hadassah is a Hebrew name. Esther is a Persian name. She was an orphan. Her parents had died. And she also is beautiful, which of course is going to play a big role in this whole story. And then finally, we have the evil Haman or Haman. He's a descendant of Agag. And when we hear the name Agag, that should signal something to us. He was king of the Amalekites during the time of Saul and Samuel. He's an enemy of the Jewish people. Amalek, so Agag is an Amalekite, or a descendant of Amalek. Amalek, if you remember, is the epitome of Israel's enemies. He is the grandson of Esau, and he's an enemy from the beginning of Israel's existence. God swore to wage war against Amalek from generation to generation. You find that in Exodus 17:16. If you remember, Saul was supposed to put Agag to death, but let him live. and somebody else killed him. Who it says he hacked him to pieces. Who was it who hacked Agag to pieces?
Samuel.
Samuel. Very good. So is not this person who just comes unanchored onto the scene. He is a descendant of Israel's historic enemies. We have to remember that too. This is a whole narrative. It's connected to the rest of Scripture. Well, I just said the whole narrative, but there's another word that we often use at Purim. They say the whole Megillah. Have you heard that term? The Megillah or the Megillah? Megillah is Hebrew for scroll, and it can actually refer to any of the 5 sacred books of the Ketuvim, which are the 3rd division of the Old Testament, in scroll form. And these are the Megillah are read in the synagogue in the course of certain festivals. So the Song of Solomon, or the Song of Songs, is read on the Sabbath of Passover week, the Book of Ruth on Shavuot, Lamentations of Jeremiah on Tisha B'Av, Ecclesiastes on the Sabbath of the week of Sukkot, and of course the Book of Esther on Purim. And so when we went to the synagogue last night, they said, okay, we're going to read the Megillah. So maybe you've heard someone say something like, we read the whole Megillah, or they put on the whole Megillah. It's always this reference to the whole thing. Okay, so they read the whole scroll of Esther. Before we dive in, we're going to do a very quick overview of each chapter in the book of Esther, just to familiarize ourselves with the story. And I'll be making some notes along the way. But does anyone know, what does Purim mean? In it would be Hebrew. What does Purim mean?
Lots.
Lots. Okay. So this comes from Haman trying to decide which day he's going to kill the Jewish people. So he cast lots. Interestingly, does God work through that? In this case, he does. In fact, in Proverbs 16:33, we read, the lot is cast into the lap, but its every decision is from the Lord. So all of this, I can't emphasize enough, when we read the book of Esther, everything it looks like a coincidence, or it just so happened. None of this just so happened. This is God orchestrating it. All right, so let's look at chapter 1. So chapter 1 begins, it says, in the days of Ahasuerus, so again, 483 to about 471 BC, the king has a party. He wants to show off Queen Vashti's beauty before the officials, but she refuses. And you don't refuse the king. And the king's entourage says, you can't let this happen, because you know what's going to happen? Feminism is going to happen. We're going to have the wives in our kingdom, and they're going to be rising up against their husbands, saying, look, Vashti did it. We can disregard the laws of our husbands too. And so Queen Vashti is displaced from her role. And in chapter 2, there's a process of looking for a new queen, looking for a place for Vashti. Goes a decree that all the beautiful young virgins of the kingdom are to be brought to the citadel at Shushan. And again, as it happens, just so happens, a Jewish man named Mordecai lives in Shushan. And who is with him? His little niece, Hadassah, Esther. And so Esther is one of the young ladies taken to the king's palace essentially for beauty treatments. And after this long process, they're going to be presented to the king for his selection. And it's interesting, Mordecai, if you look at verse 10, Esther 2:10, he tells her, Esther did not make known her people or her kindred, for Mordecai had instructed her that she should not make them known. Mordecai is like many of my Jewish friends. He knows that in times of trouble, who gets targeted? The Jewish people. Ukraine right now, I just read an article, Ukraine is targeting rabbis in the northern part of Ukraine. They're finding the rabbis and going after them. Every time there is a national upheaval or an international upheaval, somehow it's blamed on the Jewish people. And Mordecai says, Esther, let me give you some advice. Don't tell anyone you're Jewish. And this is common throughout Jewish history. If you read Jewish history, there are Jewish parents who, especially during the Holocaust, told their children, never reveal to anyone you're Jewish. In fact, many parents did not tell their own children they were Jewish. And then years later, they found out. And they have this identity crisis. In fact, that happened a few weeks ago. I was in Michigan at a Holocaust museum, and I was talking with a Holocaust survivor who was a child during the Holocaust, and he was raised by a Catholic family for quite a while. He thought he was Catholic. And then after the war, he was a young man, and he was doing some research and found out, no, his name was Rene. They said, no, Rene, you're not Catholic, you're Jewish. And so he had this identity crisis of, who am I? What everything I knew was a lie. So anyways, this happens during these times of anti-Semitism throughout history. So Esther goes before the king and he selects her. And it says in verse 17, the king loved Esther more than all the other women, and she obtained grace and favor in his sight. So again, is it a coincidence from a human perspective? Oh, it just so happens that of all these young women, the king of Persia selects this Jewish girl. It seems like a coincidence. It's no coincidence, is it? The Lord is orchestrating all of these things. He's behind the curtain, unseen, but he's doing all of these things. And so Mordecai, who sits at the king's gate, that doesn't just mean he sat there begging every day or loafing around. He was a court official in the king's court. And he sits at the king's gate. And as he's sitting there, he overhears two of the king's servants plotting to harm the king. And so he warns Esther about the plot to harm the king. She's now the queen, by the way. He warns her, and Queen Esther tells the king about the plot. And who gets the credit? Mordecai. She says, this is from Mordecai. He's the one who gave me this information. And incidentally, about 20 years later, in 465 BC, so this was these people who were, these two men, they were royal bodyguards who were plotting to kill him. About 20 years later, 465 BC, it is indeed the royal bodyguard and a eunuch in the court who end up assassinating Ahasuerus. So she saved him for a time, and yet he ultimately is assassinated anyway. So the two servants are executed via the gallows, which is a recurring theme in the book. Gallows are a common sight. And the event is recorded in the King's Chronicles. So in his royal diaries, it says Mordecai the king, or Mordecai the servant, thwarted an assassination attempt of the king. So again, note that there's this hand behind the curtain orchestrating it all. Mordecai is in the court, just so happens to be. Esther just happens to become the queen. The king just happens to become indebted to Mordecai and sees how much he can trust Esther. So the stage for the Jewish people's deliverance is being set. And if I can just say this as an encouragement to us as believers, I don't know about you, but I often look at what is happening in our world. I look at Ukraine. Right now, the Friends of Israel workers in Ukraine are trying to help the Jewish people, get them out of Ukraine to Poland, allow them to make aliyah to Israel. That's dangerous stuff. Their lives are hanging in the balance. We see the culture we live in. That's just seems to, you think it's reached its bottom and then it just drops even more. And sometimes we can be upset about that. We can think, what an awful world. But what is God doing? None of our world, none of the things we see happening, none of the evil things go unnoticed by God, do they? He's orchestrating. And by the way, that's why he gives us prophecy. Part of it is to be an encouragement to us. But I digress. So chapter 3, it's about 5 years later, and the king promotes Haman, who again is a descendant of Agag, to the second in command in the empire, only after the king, only after Ahasuerus or Xerxes. And Haman requires that all court officials bow down and pay homage to him. And this is more than mere respect. We're not talking about, hey, new rule in the kingdom. I want to make sure you give me a salute when I walk by. That's not what this is talking about. This is a form of worship. This is you bow down to me when I pass by. There's worship involved here. And for many of the Gentiles, the people in the Persian Empire, is this a problem? No problem. But it is a problem for a certain people. Which people? The Jewish people. Because the Shema says what? Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. There is no other God. Certainly the 10 Commandments. Shall have no other gods besides Yahweh. So, like Daniel, like Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego, all of whom, by the way, were also captives, Mordecai refuses to bow down to Haman. So let's keep this in mind. Mordecai is like Daniel. I love Daniel. Mordecai and Daniel are the epitome of what the Jewish people should be in exile. They're going to do everything they can to seek the welfare of their people. Mordecai saves the king's life. He wants the welfare of his kingdom where he's living. He's going to bloom where he's planted. However, there are certain things he will not do. He will not violate the word of God, will he? There are some lessons for us living, as it were, in an exile of our own. So note that the king's servants in chapter 3, verse 4, spoke to Mordecai daily, and he would not listen to them. This is the same terminology used in Genesis chapter 39 in reference to Joseph. You remember Potiphar's wife, she tempts him. And she doesn't just say one day, hey, come on into my house. What does she do? Every day. In fact, it says, as she spoke to Joseph day after day, he did not listen to her. This is the same phrase here when it says that the king's servant spoke to him daily. They spoke to him day after day. They're trying to entice him. Mordecai, you should bow down. Just bow down. Come on. It really wouldn't be that big a deal. No one else has to know. Bow down to Haman. Everything can be fine. Everything will be okay. This was a temptation. But Mordecai refuses, and that angers Haman. And he could have just said, I'm going to kill Mordecai. But that's not what he says. What does he say? He says that Mordecai, he was not content to kill only Mordecai, for the servants, quote, had told him of the people of Mordecai. So he knows Mordecai is Jewish. And so Haman wants to annihilate the Jewish people living in the Persian kingdom. Not just Mordecai, all the people. After all, if this one Jewish man refused to worship, then it stands to reason that the entire people would. These are the people of God. These are the people who are supposed to be the best and brightest, if you remember, of the kingdom. They were the elite. He sought a final solution to the Jewish problem. Is that familiar to you? World War II, the Holocaust, Hitler at the Wannsee Conference, they developed the final solution to the Jewish problem. Note to anti-Semites, if you ever get it in your head that you are going to annihilate the Jewish people, you better get ready to be on the ash heap of history, because it never works, does it? Hitler learned that lesson the hard way. Haman will also learn that lesson. So the pur, or the lot, was cast to determine the time to annihilate the Jewish people. Haman thinks, all right, I'm going to roll the dice, as it were. I'll find out, what do the gods say? When's the right time to kill the Jewish people? And so again, the pur was connected to the will of God, or the gods, likely the god Ahura Mazda, who is the creator god of Zoroastrianism, which would have been the religion of the Persians at that time. And the pur determined that the date would be the month of Adar on the Jewish calendar, which is approximately the months we're in, February, March. On the Hebrew calendar, it's Adar. So Haman explains in verse 9 of chapter 3 his solution. or his problem with a certain people. Look at that. Chapter 3, verse 9. If it is pleasing to the king, let it be decreed that they be destroyed. And I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who carry on the king's business to put into the king's treasuries. So he explains this. The king ultimately signs the decree, which is irrevocable, can't go back on it. The Jewish people in Persia are going to be destroyed. Now, there's this interesting phrase there, this interesting concept that Haman promises to pay 10,000 talents of silver into the king's treasuries. Why would he do that? Well, according to the Moody Bible Commentary, which was edited by Michael Radelnik, a Jewish scholar, it was likely to offset the loss of tax revenue for the government resulting from the genocide. So think about that. They're going to annihilate hundreds, maybe thousands of their own citizens, Jewish citizens. What's going to happen? There's far fewer people paying taxes now. And so Haman says, look, won't cost you a thing. I'll put my own money into the coffers. Just let me annihilate these people. The king does it. And so the decree goes out into the kingdom under rulers, and it said that rulers are to destroy their Jewish residents on the 13th of Adar. And so although the matter was settled with the king and with Haman, the Jewish people and some of their Gentile neighbors in Shushan were perplexed. Look at verse 15, 3:15. It says, the couriers went out impelled by the king's command while the decree was issued at the citadel in Susa. And while the king and Haman sat down to drink, the city of Susa was in confusion. This makes no sense. Why the Jewish people? Why would you want to kill them? I had a professor years ago, Bible professor. He said, when you look at world events, particularly as it concerns anti-Semitism, and they don't make sense, guess who's probably behind them? The author of confusion, the enemy, right? And that's what we see here. The people say, what do you want to kill the Jewish people for? But the decree has been issued. So in chapter 4, the decree reaches the Jewish people. Mordecai is distraught. He tears his clothes. He sits in sackcloth and ashes. And Esther's attendants go to her and say, your cousin Mordecai is not doing so well. There's something wrong. And so she sends the servants to find out why he's so distraught. He says, we're going to be killed. And he says, but you can do something. Request a hearing with the king. You've got access to power. Use your power. She sends back a message to Mordecai. And she says, according to Persian law, I could be killed for going to the king without an invitation. And in fact, she hasn't seen him in 30 days. She hasn't been called for. So this could be certain death for her. And what's Mordecai's response? He says, you too are a Jew. You won't escape. They're going to find out that you're Jewish. You won't escape this. And then he says something that believers should take to heart. He says, for if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. Yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this. So he says, I know God's going to ultimately deliver our people. He's promised never to allow us to be destroyed. We might be destroyed. The Jewish people will not be. There'll be deliverance somehow. But he says, maybe God has put you in your position for this moment. And so Esther says what we should all say. She says, pray for me, right? She says, gather the Jews in Shushan, fast for me, pray for me. I'll go to the king. And then she says this famous line, if I perish, I perish. Esther's going to do the right thing and let God handle the results. Well, in chapter 5, Esther stands within the view of the king, and thankfully she finds favor with him. And he extends the golden scepter to Esther, meaning, come on in, Esther. So she comes in, and the king says, what's your request? Up to half the kingdom. Whatever you want, Esther. What's your request? And it's interesting. Esther doesn't say, King, let me tell you about this sleaze bag you have in your kingdom. That's not what she says. What does she say? She says, I want you and Haman to come to a banquet at my house. So he says, all right, we'll do that. Well, Haman at the same time is unaware that Esther is Jewish. And it says he went out that day joyful with a glad heart because he's going to go to a banquet at the queen's residence. But he's indignant at Mordecai's continual refusal to worship him. Haman brags to his friends and his wife about his riches and his promotion, his family blessings, and the banquet. Because he sees this, he's like, man, I am climbing the social and political ladder. I'm the second in command in the kingdom. I'm going to get rid of these enemies of mine. And guess what? Top it all off, I'm going with the king to the queen's banquet tomorrow. However, his joy is diminished because he said, I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. So again, notice it's not simply Mordecai the man. It's not this guy Mordecai is really a thorn in my side. That's not what he says. He says Mordecai the Jew. He ties his hatred for Mordecai to being Jewish. And so his wife and friends, he tells his wife and friends tell him, hey, why don't you build a gallows? And then suggest to the king that Mordecai be hanged. And Haman says, great idea. I'm going to do it. So in chapter 6, what just so happens? Well, that night, the king drank a little too much iced tea, evidently, a little too much caffeine. He can't sleep. And we have one of these seeming coincidences where the king can't sleep. And so he says, all right, to one of his servants, bring in the Chronicles. Let's read through them. Put me to sleep. Imagine having the congressional record. President Biden says, I can't sleep tonight. Hey, to his aide, bring in the congressional records and start reading them to me. I don't know about you. That'd take about 3 minutes for me. I'd be out. Well, that's the concept here, that this is going to happen. But it was found written that Mordecai had told of Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs, the doorkeepers, who had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. So another coincidence, right? With quotes, another coincidence. The passage he happens to read from is the passage that talks about how Mordecai saved his life. And he realizes, I never did anything for him. You ever have a scenario like that? I did the other day. I realized I never sent a thank you note to this lady in the Jewish community. I owed a thank you note to. And so in this case, he says, hey, we need to do something for Mordecai. Well, at that point, Haman just happens, again, a coincidence, to be on his way to talk to the king about building a gallows for Mordecai. He's going to make this late night run to the citadel, to the palace. The king invites him in and asks him, what should be done, Mordecai? I know you've got a problem. We'll talk about that. But what do you think should be done for the man whom the king delights to honor? And what is Mordecai, or what is Haman thinking? I know exactly who you're talking about. And so he says, all right, here's what you should do. Give him the royal robe, give him the king's horse, parade him through the city square with a proclamation. Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. And so here we have this twist of irony. What does the king say? Great idea, Haman. Go do that for Mordecai, would you? And you can almost see Haman's face, can't you? You can almost see it. Huge eyes, and his jaw goes slack. What? No. I thought this was about me. But Haman's angered, but he does exactly as the king commanded. He knows he's not going to cross the king. So he tells his wife and friends, and they say, if Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish descent, you're not going to prevail against him. You're surely going to fall before him. Now, there's a couple of views. Why would this have been? Well, first of all, we would say the same. I would say the same thing. If you're going to try to annihilate the Jewish people, forget about it. You're wasting your time. It's not going to happen. But the Moody Bible Commentary has this interesting note. They say their reasoning for this decision may be explained by the Zoroastrian preoccupation with signs and moments, and their attendant belief that the beginning of an event is often a reliable portent of its end. Thus, Mordecai's temporary exaltation over Haman signified a final permanent exaltation, in which position Mordecai would certainly do all he could to remove the enemy of the Jews from power. So they say, hey, according to our belief system, this thing isn't going to work out so well because it didn't begin very well, right? So instead of all's well that ends well, it's like all that begins poorly is going to end poorly. Again, this is a microcosm of what is going to happen to the enemies of Israel. Remember Genesis 12:3, we talked about this last week. God promises, I will bless those who bless you, but what else? I will curse him who curses you. And all throughout history, God has kept his promise. Enemies of Israel perish. And so Satan, who is the greatest persecutor of the Jewish people, and who will continue to persecute even through the tribulation during what's called the time of Jacob's trouble, he, like Haman, will not prevail. He should take a note from the story of Haman. Well, we end chapter 6 with Haman being ushered to Esther's banquet. Chapter 7, the scene is the banquet. And Esther, it's almost like she gets cold feet. I don't know if that's exactly what happened, but she doesn't come out and call out Haman. She says to them, if I found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me at my petition. I'm sorry, this is the second banquet. If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be given at my petition, and my people at my request. For we have been sold, my people and I, to be destroyed, to be killed, to be annihilated. So she doesn't just say, there's someone who wants to do harm to my people. She gives them three options, or three descriptions. Destroyed, how's he going to destroy them? Kill them. And what's his aim? Annihilation. He thinks he's going to wipe out the Jewish people. And the king says, who would do this? And what does Esther say? That's your guy, Haman. Haman is the guy who wants to kill the Jewish people. And so Haman is terrified. The king leaves to go into the garden. He's probably seething. And when he returns, what does he see? You see Haman laying on Esther's lap, begging her to stop the king. But he doesn't know that's what happened. He thinks, not only is this guy trying to destroy a bunch of my people in my kingdom, he's assaulting Esther. And so what is the result? Well, the result is Haman is hanged on the very gallows he intended for Mordecai. Again, Purim is God's answer to anti-Semitism. Because what's going to happen? Even in the end times, when the Jewish people have their back up against the wall, Antichrist and his armies are coming against them. It's going to be in that very same battle where who comes? Jewish people call on the Messiah. He comes riding on a white horse and he annihilates Israel's enemies. This is what's going to happen throughout history. The very gallows, or the very means by which the Jewish people are intended to be destroyed, the anti-Semites are going to be destroyed. Interestingly enough, how did Hitler die? Suicide, right? He had an ignominious death. His ashes were burned. They find the ashes. Well, chapter 8, Esther explains to the king how Mordecai is related to her. So this is kind of the aftermath. He says, she explains that Mordecai is my cousin. She raised me. Mordecai is now elevated to that position that he originally had. He's given the king's signet ring. It's like his Visa card. So he gets the signet ring. He gets Haman's house, or his property. And that doesn't mean just his physical home, but everything he owns. And so Esther pleads with the king to revoke Haman's orders to annihilate the Jewish people. And so the king can't undo what's been done. What does he do? He gives them permission to write their own counter orders. So the order permits the Jewish people to gather and to protect themselves, and also to destroy, kill, and annihilate. Remember, that's exactly what Haman wanted to do, but it gives the Jewish people the permission to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the forces of any people or province that would assault them, both little children and women, and to plunder their possessions. And so the couriers of the king take this message throughout the kingdom. There's celebration among the Jewish people. And it's shocking. There's this point. Look at chapter 8, verse 17. You may have overlooked this point. 8:17. In each and every province and in each and every city, wherever the king's commandment and his decree arrived, there was gladness and joy for the Jews, a feast and a holiday. Got that. That makes perfect sense. But look at the rest of it. And many among the peoples, among the Goyim, the Gentiles of the land, became Jews, for the dread of the Jews had fallen on them. So this meant a change culturally and spiritually. This required, think about it, for the men, circumcision. It involved a joining of themselves to the Jewish people. It's very similar to Ruth. My God shall be your God, your God shall be my God, your people shall be my people. There are Gentiles living in Persia who say, that's the people I want to ally myself with. And they become converts, as it were, to the Jewish nation. Well, in chapter 9, on the day of Haman's decree that it was to be enacted, the Jewish people fight back. And it says, no one could withstand them because the fear of them fell upon all people. There are 500 people killed in Shushan. Others, including Haman's 10 sons, are also killed in various provinces. And Esther then says, let the Jewish people in Shushan destroy more enemies the next day. We have a 2-day assault. And let the bodies of Haman's sons be hung on the gallows that he prepared for Mordecai. So the next day, there's 300 more killed in Shushan. An additional 75,000 are killed throughout the entire Persian kingdom. Mordecai is elevated to a place of prominence in the kingdom. And Purim is instituted by Mordecai, the festival of Purim. And the decree is to the Jewish people that they should celebrate yearly the 14th and 15th days of the month of Adar, it was yesterday and today, as the days on which the Jews had rest from their enemies, as the month which was turned from sorrow to joy for them, and from mourning to a holiday or a holy day, that they should make them days of feasting and joy, of sending presents to one another and gifts to the poor. And so Mordecai sent letters to the Jewish communities throughout 127 provinces, and he establishes Purim. Today, if you ask Jewish people, what is the motto of the Jewish people? This is what they say. They tried to kill us. We won. Let's eat. That is the motto of the Jewish people. They tried to kill us. We won. Let's eat. That's why I love Jewish ministry, because there's always something to eat. Well, in fact, in the Passover liturgy, which is at the Seder, there's this comment, this part of the liturgy says, in every generation, they rise up to destroy us, but the Holy One, blessed be he always delivers us from their hands. Well, in chapter 10, it's reiterated that Mordecai was second only to King Ahasuerus, and he is respected and honored by the Jewish people. In fact, today, you go into the Jewish community, you'll find people named Mordi, which is short for Mordecai. I have a friend named Mordi. Well, what are the lessons of Purim? We just went through the whole Megillah, and well, it's in English. The Megillah is in Hebrew. We went through it. What does it mean? What are the lessons? Well, first of all, what it means to the Jewish community today. It's a minor holiday on the Jewish calendar. As opposed to Passover or Yom Kippur or Rosh Hashanah, those are major holidays. These are minor holidays. Yeah. Like yesterday, I went to the synagogue. The synagogue wasn't, their business offices were not closed yesterday. On the major holidays, the whole Jewish community closes down. So it's a minor holiday. It's celebrated mostly by parents for their children. It's similar to Hanukkah in this way. Hanukkah is not something that many adults celebrate. It's more, they celebrate it for the children. It's celebrated on the 14th of Adar in February and March, and on the 15th, as it was in Susa. Well, how is it celebrated today? Well, for this, I'm going to share my screen. Let's see, make sure I have it up here. Here we go. All right. Give me a thumbs up if you see this. It says Purim. You see that? No. Okay. Let's try this one more time. Let's see here. How about now? Yes? Okay, great. So I thought I'd share with you a few pictures. This is my friend, the rabbi, at Purim about 2 years ago. When it's celebrated, it's a carnival. Think of carnival atmosphere. It's very celebratory. It's loud, and you dress up. Now, historically, you dress up like Mordecai or Esther, and some people do that. But you'll see other costumes. Usually, they're not scary. A lot of Jewish people don't celebrate the occult aspects of like a Halloween. He is not meant to be scary. He is Gene Simmons, who is Jewish, from the band Kiss. Okay, so they had every year at this synagogue they have a different theme, and that year it was like a rock and roll theme. This year it was superheroes, and I'll show you a picture of that in just a moment. They go through at the service. They read through the whole Megillah. It's in Hebrew, and what's tragic about this is that it's read in Hebrew, and most of the people listening can't understand it. They have no idea. They don't understand Hebrew, and so it's just perfunctory. They go through it. They read it. Okay, we did it. We read the Megillah. Did anyone know this? Did anyone hear anything about God's preservation of the Jewish people? No. So the only thing that's in English, at least at most conservative synagogues, is any commentary the rabbi might give. Now, you have to experience it to understand it, but they interpose at this synagogue songs, and the songs they'll take secular music and they apply Purim themed words to it. So this particular year they had songs by Kiss, and they applied the whole story of Esther to the songs. Last night they were about superheroes. So the whole Megillah is read. Back in Deuteronomy chapter 25 verse 19, God commanded Israel to blot out Amalek's name. So whenever the name Haman, who's a descendant, is read, the people make noises. They say boo, and then they twirl these things called groggers. Or yep, Jerry and Debbie have some. They will do that. Or they have, my kids last night had these clappers. They're like these little hand clappers that you make as much noise as you can to blot out Haman's name whenever the rabbi comes to that section of the Hebrew Megillah. Alcohol flows freely at Purim. Drunkenness is the norm. So this is it's sad for me as a believer to go to Purim, because the meaning is, the heart is ripped out of it, of the significance of Purim, and there's a lot of drunkenness. And this comes from the Talmud, and it says, it is the duty of a man to mellow himself with wine on Purim until he cannot tell the difference between cursed be Haman and blessed be Mordecai. Another source says, whether sober or inebriated, we fear no evil, for you, God, are with us forever. So a pretty tragic response, but it's part of Purim for many Jewish people, Jewish communities. Now, this is the real star of Purim today, as far as I'm concerned. These are called Hamantaschen. They're a three-cornered pastry or cookie meant to resemble Haman's hat. Where that legend comes from, I don't know. I think it's more that these were German cookies that they infused some meaning to. But Hamantaschen actually means poppy seeds pocket. It's Yiddish. Mon means poppy seeds, tash means pocket. But then you can also see the word Haman or Haman. So there's some ambiguity as to exactly where that comes from. But traditionally, these are filled with poppy seeds, but they're also filled with things like prunes, raspberry, blueberry. Last night we had some that were chocolate filled, raspberry filled. Very good. If you live near a Jewish bakery, run and go get some leftover Purim. They're so good. I was at a Jewish bakery the other day. Or you can find a recipe online. I don't think they're too difficult. Rabbis at this time and other respected of the members of the Jewish community are often made fun of good-naturedly. It's not a mean thing. So here's the example. Oh, I guess, did I get rid of that? Okay, here's a couple of years. This is last year at Purim. These are the two rabbis. This is my friend Felipe and his assistant Rabbi Jonathan, and they're dressed as the Frozen characters. Who are they? Anna and I can't remember. I'm just hearing "Let It Go" in my head right now. But they dressed up like women. They're parodied. The kids laugh at the rabbis, and it's all in fun. Now this was last night. So if you can see, we have Batman over here. This is the assistant rabbi. He's dressed up as Batman. Here is the worship director. He's Superman. He's playing the music. Over here, you have the senior rabbi dressed up like Spider-Man. And then these are members of the congregation. They have a band and they're playing different music. They've changed the lyrics to, but it's a big celebration. Lots of kids, even some parents dress up. What's interesting, has nothing to do with Purim, but you'll notice they're dressed as superheroes. And many of the superheroes in American lore were created by Jewish people. So if you look at the history of Superman, I believe he came about during the war. He was kind of the superhero the Jewish people needed. That's often how it's presented. But there's entire books written about this. It's very interesting. Let's see, I think, is that it? Yeah, that's all I have for slides. So I'm going to stop sharing. What else can I tell you? Oh, so that's what it means to the Jewish people. Frankly, it doesn't mean a lot. And they would take issue with what I just said. And I don't mean that to be a negative. It's not a major festival for them. On last Friday night, I was at the synagogue for the Shabbat service, Kabbalat Shabbat service, the Friday night service. And the rabbi spoke on the meaning of Purim. Now, what I've just presented to you, and I think you would not need me to even present this to you, the meaning of Purim, part of it is God's sovereignty, right? It's that even behind the curtain, he's acting. Even when we can't see him, he's at work orchestrating. The rabbi's response, his interpretation was, he said, God is not mentioned anywhere in the book of Esther. And that is symbolic to us. It tells us that we need to take things into our own hands. We are responsible for our own destiny. So unbiblical, isn't it? Completely, I believe, misses the point of Esther. So that is a tragic aspect of their meaning, of how they celebrate it. But what should it mean to believers, Christian? Well, the book of Esther is a picture of Israel's history. And so again, where is God during all of this? He's orchestrating everything, isn't he? Even though we don't see him, he's there. Interestingly, Martin Luther did not believe Esther was worthy of being included in the canon of Scripture. He thought it was apocryphal and it didn't mention God, and therefore it shouldn't be included in the Scriptures at all. But it is part of the canon. The Jewish people considered it part of the canon long before Christians recognized it as so. This is also, it's God's answer to anti-Semitism. So remember, anti-Semitism comes in every generation. America has been an anomaly for the Jewish people, where the Jewish people can live free from persecution. But in every generation throughout the history of the Jewish people, someone's trying to kill them, even today. And so this is as a testament to God's faithfulness to his chosen people. Though they're persecuted, he delivers them. though they're in rebellion. I mean, remember where these people are at the time of Esther. They are in Persia. They're not in the land. Anytime they're out of the land, it's symbolic of their alienation from God. They've disobeyed him. And yet God delivers them. And he says he will never allow them to be destroyed. So again, consider also God's promise to Abraham that he would curse those who curse his people Israel. And so just consider the empires that have warred against the Jewish people. Egypt, gone. Assyria, gone. Babylon, gone. Greece, gone. Rome, gone. God keeps his promises. And Esther is part of that. So Purim is essentially a microcosm of God's plan for anti-Semitism. Those who dare to lift their fingers against Israel will find themselves being judged by God. So that's the basic presentation. Here, just one moment. Yes, I'm teaching. You got to go out, okay? My daughter just came in. She wanted to see what was going on in here. Sorry about that. That's the presentation on Purim. I know that was a whirlwind. So I want to just take a few questions here, and feel free to add if you have questions. Let's see. Jean-Paul asked, have the annals of the king been found? Not that I know of. Not that I know of. That does not mean they're not there. But as far as I've, in my reading, they have not been found. But there's always, archaeologists are always digging around back over there and finding Bible confirming finds. So they may have been found, or they may yet future be found. Ralph asked, please comment on the idea found in some translations that Haman built an elaborate stake on which he sought to impale Mordecai, and upon which he himself was impaled. No gallows, no concept of hanging in these versions. I'm only vaguely familiar with that it wasn't actually a gallows, that it was a stake. I would have to look at what those versions say and where they're basing it, especially in the Hebrew. Be interesting to know what that term is, if it's what it refers to. So unfortunately, Ralph, I can't comment much beyond that. I'm sorry, but that'd be an interesting study. So some of you, I see Elizabeth Werner says that they got some hamantashen from Israel with chocolate and fig filling. That's the stuff you want. That's the good stuff. I'm a raspberry guy myself, but I also like Nutella. They put Nutella in that. I'm a goner. John Paul asks which synagogue I go to in Vegas. I go to different ones. I don't go every week, but I have relationships with a few here. The one I usually attend is Temple Beth Shalom in Las Vegas. And if you are coming out, let me know. I'd love to meet with you, John. Linda asked if Luther was anti-Semitic. I mentioned that he didn't believe that Esther should be included in the canon. Yes, Luther, especially towards the end of his life, was anti-Semitic, and there's different theories as to why. We did look at some of his writings in last week's session, and he was originally pretty kind towards the Jewish people. In fact, my favorite thing, he calls the Catholic Church, what did he call the priests and the popes? Something like, I know he uses the word dolts. He said, if a bunch of dolts like them were trying to or persecuting me all the time, I wouldn't believe the gospel either. But later on, and he changed and turned on the Jewish people. What is to be said about the fact that Mordecai chose to not return to the land when given the opportunity? Was he so comfortably acculturated there in Persia, he couldn't bring himself to leave? I don't know that the text necessarily tells us about that. We don't, as far as I know, we don't know that Mordecai didn't return. We do know not everyone did. It was a very comfortable place to live, as you mentioned. And I see what you're talking about. You're talking about with the option to return. Yes. So I'm sorry about that. Yes. So he would have been one of the people who thrived there. So really, if you look at Xerxes was, as far as we know, very kind to the Jewish people. I mean, he allowed Haman to do this act, but it was a perplexing thing to the people. So as far as they knew, this was This was out of the ordinary to happen in their kingdom. So it may have been very much like many Jewish people today. I mean, there are more Jewish people living outside of Israel today than there are living inside of Israel. That's going to change, we know, prophetically, but particularly the United States, this is a good place to live. Interestingly, if you look at Ukraine, I mentioned a little earlier that Friends of Israel is helping a lot of Jewish people out of Ukraine and to make aliyah, to go back home to Israel. That is happening. France, it's happened in France as Muslim persecution of Jews ramps up. And we see it here. I just read an article last week about a Jewish man who was talking about whether or not to keep his American passport, because now he's in Israel. Do I really need my American passport now that I have a safe haven in Israel? And I know I was talking to a man at the synagogue the other day. He's only a little bit older than myself. And he told me that his father was Austrian and he is eligible for Austrian citizenship. And he says, I'm going to get it. And I said, his name is DJ. I said, DJ, why would you want Austrian citizenship? You have United States citizenship. He said, no, most Jews have at least 2 passports because we know that things can get bad very quickly. And he's seeing what's happening in the United States. It's still a wonderful place for Jews, but there's some bad things on the horizon. So anyway, I hope that helps to answer that question. Sylvester, are Ethiopian Jews the only ones from Africa? Interesting. So the Jewish community in Ethiopia, these are people who they've actually been able to do DNA testing, and they are related ethnically, biologically to the Jewish community. Now, there are others. I know of a Jewish community in Uganda. Interestingly, prior to the reestablishment of the state of Israel in the land of Israel, Uganda was a place where it was considered a potential site for the new Jewish state. Thankfully, that didn't happen. They're meant to be in the land of Israel. But there are Jewish people, a Jewish community there. They are converts. So these are native Ugandan Gentiles who converted to Judaism, but they would have a right to return to Israel. If they have a right to citizenship there because they have converted. And then there are Moroccan Jews as well. So it's not only the Ethiopian Jewish people, they're the ones that we know the most about culturally, but no, there are others. Betsy, what does history say of Esther after this book? After the king was assassinated, how long did she live? Did she have children with this king? You know, it would be history. It would not be biblical. We don't have any other information about what happened to Esther after. As far as I know, there's not a lot of information. In fact, even in the Jewish community, many Jewish people believe this is an allegory. They don't believe this ever happened. There's not a lot of extra biblical evidence. Now, I don't believe you have to have extra biblical evidence for it to be true, to believe it. But as far as I know, there's not a lot of extra biblical evidence or anything that talks about what happened to Esther. Let's see. Will the book of Esther become clear to the people in the millennium? I need an elaboration on that. Exactly what you mean by that. We're going to know the scriptures. Maybe the lessons of Esther will become more clear, especially following what the Jewish people go through during the tribulation. But if I didn't answer that, offer maybe some clarification. So any other questions? I see Lee says that the word in Hebrew means gallow or gardom, which means scaffold. So yeah, probably refers to a scaffold, maybe not so much the stake we had talked about. Any other questions? All right, well, you're welcome to stick around for more. Just a couple of things I will say. Next week is our final class. please come to this class. This is going to be a very important one. We're going to be looking at a history of anti-Semitism, but I'm focusing primarily on quote unquote Christian anti-Semitism. So alleged or professing Christians, their history of anti-Semitism is a long one. And we're going to begin in 70 AD, and we're going to come all the way up to 2022. And I'll still only do it in an hour. So don't worry, I won't keep you too long. But please come back for that. The other thing I wanted to mention is last week, I told you about a book that I recommend called What on Earth is God Doing by Dr. Ronald Showers. You can get that through the Friends of Israel website, through the store. It's an excellent little book that looks at the history of the world and the history of the Jewish people and Satan's conflict with God. And it's excellent. So I recommend that. But another one I recommend to you is this book. It's called The Feasts of Israel. It's by my friend Bruce Scott. And he takes all of the feasts listed in the Bible, as well as feasts that have been added subsequently, and goes through the history, how they're celebrated, their significance. That can also be found at the Friends of Israel store. And I highly recommend that as well. I think those are my final announcements, but thank you for coming. Stick around. I'll be sticking around if you have any other questions. Happy to talk with you, but if not, I will see you next week, same time, same place, same link, and we will look at the history of anti-Semitism in our final of 3 classes. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Shalom.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Very good.
Thank you.
Thank you. This is great.
Thank
Thank you
you.
for coming.
Thank you.
It was good.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Very good.
Have a good week, guys.
You too. Thank you.
Thank you from Shirley.
We'll be praying for all of you.
Yeah.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you, Ty.
Thank you, Ty.
Thanks, everyone.
Shalom.
Bye. Shalom.
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 I was at Purim in 1971, a trip to Israel. It was like a county fair.
Really? Yes. The Steve Herzig, our North American director, and Chris Katulka, assistant director to the North American Ministries, they just did a podcast episode on their podcast, The Jew and the Gentile, and they talk about what it's like in Israel on Purim. I've not been there on Purim. I've been to Las Vegas's version of Purim. It's crazy enough. I don't need to go to Israel for that, but
My first trip to Israel was during Purim. And they were drinking a lot, yes.
yes, it's kind of like you get the license to drink on Purim. I find that regrettable, but that's how they do it.
Okay.
Dressing up, not good.
No.
I can share in New York right now, yesterday and today. That's a big thing in the Jewish community in New York City, is to get on. They have what they call them Purim buses, and they
Okay.
drive in New York City and they drink and they get loud and they get drinking and they get louder.
My goodness.
My sister lives in that area.
Okay.
What happened there? Oh, did we get lost?
That's all right.
Oh, okay.
There we go.
I lost you all. Yeah, I am also, well, my family's from Israel, but I'm in New Jersey.
Okay. Yeah.
And I work alongside of Friends of Israel as well.
Well, thank you, Lee. We're glad to have you on board. We
I
can
don't-
always use help.
Well, I work alongside of like the conferences and things like that.
Yeah.
And go with Kathy Miles. You probably know Kathy.
I know Kathy very well. She's a
Yeah.
good friend.
Yep.
Yes.
She's been a friend of mine since college.
Really.
Yes.
That's
We
great.
go-
Yeah, we love our volunteers, and it's kind of a Friends of Israel family. It's always fun to come on and see everybody, because we get emails from people and comments on Facebook, and then we come on something like this and we can actually talk face to face with everyone. So
Right.
we enjoy that.
This is good. This is definitely good.
Okay.
Relate to so many of the things that you spoke about, because, you know, being Jewish and then being out of, not in Israel, but here, you see and you hear a lot of things. and
Yes.
a believer as a Jew for me has been doubly. I get it from both sides,
Sure. Sure. Yeah.
but
Well, I always think Jewish believers are we're all equal, but they get just a little more richness because they've got the cultural background. They have some of that significance, and then when they meet their Messiah, it all makes sense.
you mentioned something about Kabbalah. That you go to a synagogue. It's Kabbalah.
Well, it's called Kabbalat with a T on the end. It's different. It just Kabbalat Shabbat. It means a welcoming of the Sabbath.
Right.
So that's a Friday night service.
I wasn't for sure I heard you right, because I'm like,
Yeah, no, not Kabbalah. I don't dabble in any of that. But
good.
no, I go every once in a while. I go on a Friday night to the service, and just to be there and get to know some of the Jewish people. So.
I think it's good. I think it kind of is an eye opener to see how Jewish people really live and what they do, and not just somebody down your street that might be Jewish, but to see how they actually live through their faith. Not every Jew does that. I mean, there are plenty of secular, but it's very neat. It's very it's eye opening, I should say.
Yeah,
and it's great to see all the people here. I was like shocked. I was like, there was 100. Oh, now we're down to 34, but there was like 110 people tonight.
I know it. I think we had maybe 150 last week. So praise the Lord. We're glad. This is more than we could reach if we just had a classroom setting, a physical classroom. So glad for that.
I won't be able to. Go ahead, whoever.
You need to take the opportunity to teach us Hebrew now.
Who,
Biblical
me?
Hebrew.
Me? Biblical Hebrew.
Any one of you that knows how to teach biblical Hebrew, that would be wonderful.
Oh, that
Well,
would
I
be
won't be your guy. I'm not I can't read it. I can get along okay in Israel just to say hi, how are you? This is my name. Where's the bathroom? But that's on my list, is to learn. So
me too.
One of these days.
Biblical Hebrew is really it's what they called Aramaic, but it is really not a whole lot different than modern Judaism. There are some differences, obviously there are some, but I mean, I can speak Hebrew. It's my language, and I speak English too. So,
right.
But it's really, when I see people say biblical, they seem to think that it's something, even more so that, if you read Hebrew, or I don't know anybody here who does, but it would be the same. If you pick up a Bible and you speak Hebrew, you read it, it's the same thing.
Sure.
Well, I've taken lessons at a Hebrew synagogue. It's Reformed, and I was enjoying it and learned a lot until they became so liberal in their teaching. I just didn't want to continue with it. But I do enjoy reading the Bible and seeing how it compares to the English translation. And so it'd be fun to do again.
I can recommend it. I don't know if you know this, Ty, but there is a class in Israel that's done online. It's similar to the Ulpan, but it's not the Ulpan. It is a Christian organization, believe it or not. It's a Jewish belief organization. Bible Israel, I think it is. I have to look it up. I don't remember, but if I think about it, I won't be here next week, unfortunately. But if you check online, you can take and learn Hebrew.
Is it biblical Hebrew? Because I really want the biblical Hebrew more than
biblical Hebrew and Hebrew are very, very, very similar. It's not like you're going to learn something that's so far off, but you understand how the language comes together. There are a lot of words in Hebrew that are the root words, and then from there they break off depending on how it's used. And so if you just have to learn from the very beginning and basics to understand. I don't know what you're specifically looking for, but that's all I can offer that I can tell you.
Well, the right time, the right place.
Right.
That's right. Well, everyone, I'm enjoying this, but we're going to close out the class, but please come back next week if you're able. All the classes are recorded. So hopefully you got an email this week that has the recorded link from last week. And should happen every week, and then you'll have all of them. So, all right.
Shalom.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
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 Bye-bye.